this speech was partially improvised. King drew together sections from other speeches he's made over the previous few years. Does that make it a bit of a cheat, or is that just to be expected?
No, it wasn't to be expected at all. In fact, it was his team were really irritated with him for doing it because they all insisted that they write a brand new speech for the big occasion in Washington. And if you go to YouTube, you can actually see the speech that they wrote. It's called the Cancel Check, and it's the first 12 minutes. But it doesn't really go down all that well. It's fine, but it's a bit flat. And so what happened is that there was a gospel singer called Mahalia Jackson who traveled with the King entourage. She's behind him on the podium, and she whispers to him at a certain point, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." So he goes to his stock of phrases he's got in his mind from being a preacher around the circuit, and he does start to do it extempore. And that's absolutely ludicrous thing to do. You never advise anybody to do that. You're totally off script. And exactly when this happened, one of his speechwriters, Walker Wyatt, turned to his colleague and he said, "Oh no, he's doing the dream," which is probably the worst judgment of any speech that's ever been uttered. So it was it was improvised and it wasn't expected. And so that clip you just played, which is part of perhaps the greatest passage of rhetoric in modern politics, was not improvised in the sense that he'd said similar things before, but it certainly wasn't intended to have been said on that occasion.
That is an amazing thing to learn. Jess, talk us through the sort of the technical details on this speech, the use of rhetoric, the biblical references, and so on. Why is it such a good example of how to write a speech?
It's a fantastic example, Hugo. I think, as Phil said, it's the best in kind of modern times. I think what Martin Luther King does so successfully is he connects with his audience, and you have to listen to it. You listen back to it, and you hear the sort of interaction with the audience to the point where they're kind of directing him and egging him on. How does he connect with them? I think the most powerful way is that use of metaphor. Every abstract concept that he talks about is linked to a real thing. He describes justice as a bright day. He talks about injustice as quicksand. These are all sort of concrete things that we know, and people in the audience, people beyond that immediate audience, and people today can still understand and still resonates with people. So it's the way he uses language, and particularly metaphor and imagery, I think, that really connected with people. People make a lot of the musicality of the speech, and it is, you listen to the thing in its entirety, and it's like a song. It builds and builds to the climax, to the peroration at the end. It's a masterpiece. It is like a song, but it's also like a picture. I mean, it's image after image that he provides us with, and I think that's why it still kind of works today, and why it's an absolutely fantastic example of rhetoric.
Chris, is this the sort of speech that you'd study when writing your own speeches, or is context very important? Prime ministers have to make so many speeches, and if you end up delivering the sort of the "I have a dream" type speech when you're, I don't know, sort of in front of audio representatives in Sunderland or something, I mean, does that work, or can you always turn to a great speech in order to seek inspiration?
Well, certainly when trying to prepare for a big speech for, say, Theresa or anyone else I've written for, you do go back and look at other speeches and seek inspiration. That's absolutely the case. But I think it would be rather hubristic to say this is a speech that you can look at too closely because it was of its time and it was delivered by an incredible individual, and would that we all had the opportunity to write for people like Martin Luther King. But there are some things you could take from it, and Jess has talked about the sort of technical aspects of it, which you can definitely lean on. I think one thing I always talk about when trying to teach people now about speech writing is to really think about start by thinking about the headline that you want at the end of the speech. What is it that you want somebody to write about the speech you have written? And although maybe he improvised it, here there was that clear theme, that clear message. I have a dream, an incredible line really to take from the speech. So there are elements you can take from it, and definitely you always go back and look at speeches. But as I say, I think the context of this was the real thing. It was a great speech, brilliantly delivered, but the context of all the people on the Mall there in Washington, of the moment when it was looking at the legislation to enhance civil rights, etc. The context was one thing that made this speech so utterly memorable, I think.
Let's move on to some other great examples of great political speeches, and we obviously couldn't not That's, of course, Winston Churchill's finest hour, and we could probably have chosen any of Churchill's wartime speeches. Jess, what makes Churchill such a great speechwriter?
Well, the interesting thing, Hugo, is that Churchill didn't love writing speeches or making speeches to begin with, but he worked and worked and worked at it. And he, I think, wrote most of his own speeches, and he would work on them sort of in the bath and in bed, and he would dictate a lot of it. I think what made him a great speaker was that he practiced and he learned his craft, and he was obviously taught rhetoric. He knew a lot about the tools and tricks of the trade. But again, it sort of comes back to that Martin Luther King point, as he really knew how to connect with people, and he knew sort of the right words, the right moments. He, used the sort of metaphors that we've talked about before very vividly in his "We Will Fight on the Beaches" speech. He also used quite a lot of humor, which you don't really kind of consider would be a thing during wartime. But everything he did kind of connected with his audience, not just if he was speaking to the Commons, but the sort of wider audience of the public, and even beyond that, to countries overseas. Wanted the message to ring out, as far as America in terms of what he was saying. So he was very aware of his audience. He knew what he was doing with his craft. And the main thing is he practiced and he practiced and practiced.
Chris, Churchill's words, they're now sort of embedded in the British psyche. We'll always have them in there. What is it about them that has sort of planted them there? How did he manage to pull that off?
Well, I think, again, context obviously matters. He was speaking at the moments of national crisis, and so they embed themselves anyway. He also had this incredibly distinctive voice, which helps to embed these language in a way that if you had a more sort of a less recognizable voice, then it probably wouldn't be so effective. But he, and Jess is right about him rehearsing and practicing everything. But again, just the way he used language to capture moments. There's this clip here that you just played there, where he uses the phraseology of "let us," where he's imploring people to sort of get on board with him to join a mission and things like that. And he would do things like that, and then speak to that greater national moment, finest hour, etc. These things that speak to actually bringing people together. And I think that's something that means that they do stick in the consciousness when you are imploring to unity and trying to bring people together, something maybe we could learn rather more about these days in politics. That's the kind of thing that means actually many, many people can find something in those speeches to cling on to because they are a point of unity.
Phil, could anyone have made Churchill's speeches, or is it important that he made them? Could he have written them for someone else? Would they have worked? What's the link between the speaker and the speech?
Well, they could have worked, but it's always been the case that politicians have had speechwriters ever since the Emperor Nero employed Seneca as his speechwriter. So it's not a novelty. I quite often do a sort of double act with Mary Beard, where she thinks that everything that's gone wrong in politics derives from the moment that politicians stop writing their own speeches. So speechwriters are to blame for the decline of politics. But needless to say, I don't agree with that, and I doubt Chris or Jess will either. Though clearly you need to write for that person. I mean, the biggest successful separation between the two, I think, is Peggy Noonan and Ronald Reagan, where Reagan is a great speaker because he was a wonderful actor, and Peggy Noonan is, the doyenne of modern speechwriters. Usually the relationship is much closer in that Peggy wrote and Ronald spoke, whereas with Ted Sorensen and John F. Kennedy, for example, and with most other relationships, less celebrated, it's really intimate. It's really close. They're there together all the time. There's a great privilege of being the speechwriter is that you do have to be present all the time to kind of get into the idiom and the language. So it's almost always collaborative, and there's almost always loads of people involved in a speech, far too many, in fact, usually. Part of the task is to keep people at bay and to be the editor-in-chief. So I wouldn't say just anybody could have done it, because clearly there was a courage in Churchill, which is substantive and material about what he really thought. And quite a lot of his party didn't think that stuff. But he didn't necessarily have to be his own writer. He was unusual in that he was such an inveterate writer of speeches. And he, in his early career, he was regarded as slightly ridiculous because he lavished rhetorical constructions on things that weren't worth it. There's a lovely story about him as a by-election candidate in Oldham in 1899. He stands in an empty church hall and he says, "Never before in the history of Lancashire have so many people of Oldham had so much to eat." And it's exactly the same construction that you get in 1940, but of course it's absurd.
Yeah.
Which just goes to show that context.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, let's jump forward a bit and let's take a listen to Margaret Thatcher's party conference speech in 1984, which was, of course, made on the same day as an IRA bomb attack at the Grand Hotel, where Thatcher and other cabinet ministers had been staying during the conference.
And the fact that we are gathered here now, shocked but composed and determined, is a sign not only that this attack has failed, but that all attempts to destroy democracy by terrorism will fail.
I mean, talk about rising to the occasion. Chris, look, making and producing a speech like that in such circumstances, knowing that you've got to sort of go out and give it. What do you turn to when you've got to sort of respond to something as on the nose as that?
Yeah, it's I guess the great challenge as a speechwriter. And when I was in Downing Street, I had to, unfortunately, on a number of occasions, write speeches for the Prime Minister in response to terrorist attacks. And, they are some speeches you labour over for weeks and go through lots of drafts, etc. And in moments like this, you do just have to respond slightly on the cuff. And at that point, I think what Phil was just talking about really matters, which is knowing intimately the person you are writing for. You've got to think, what is it that they want to say instantly, off the cuff, from the heart? What is their instinctive response to this situation they are in? Again, typically in moments like that, you want to portray a unifying message because you know that people are fearful, so you're trying to bring people together. So that's almost the core of what you have to do. But then you also have to find a way to sort of move on beyond that moment, interpret it, but then move on so that you're not dwelling on kind of what's happened. And I think that clip you've just played there about, not only has it failed this time, but the attempts will always fail, is trying to take the specific and make a more general point. And that's kind of the technique for moments like that in crisis: bring people together and then try and use that to move on to something beyond the particular moment.
Let's take a listen now to a speech made by Thatcher's political rival, Neil Kinnock, that was made a few days before the 1992 election.
Margaret Thatcher wins on Thursday. I warn you not to be ordinary. I warn you not to be young. I warn you not to fall ill. And I warn you not to grow old.
Sorry, that's excuse me, that's 83, not 92. My mistake. Phil, why does that work so well? Is it the repetition? Is it the sort of the foreboding, I warn you nature of it? What's happening there?
Yeah, it's both those things. I think it is the technique we're very familiar with of repetition, which goes all the way back to Cicero and Aristotle, and he does that beautifully. I think it's also his voice. I mean, Kinnock has an but also I think that speech and all of Kinnock's speeches in a way. And I'm an enormous fan of Neil Kinnock as a speaker, but they show the limits of speeches as well, because Neil Kinnock didn't become Prime Minister. He was, if it were a contest for who were the best speaker, for a debating competition, Neil Kinnock would have won, but he didn't win. The Labour Party lost, and all of his speeches were magnificently effective within the Labour Party, like his famous speech in Bournemouth where he expelled militant. And there were great rallying cries for the faithful, but they didn't extend beyond. So you have to say there's a failure rhetorically there to extend the audience, which is also something you're always trying to do. And when you're writing for a prime minister, as we've all done, you are, in theory at least, trying to write for the widest possible audience, not just the people who already agree with you. You know that not everyone is going to listen, but you're trying to extend beyond, and that's something that Kinnock didn't manage to do in that speech.
That's interesting. Let's listen to David Cameron's bid for the Conservative Party leadership in 2005, a speech called Change to Win.
And let the message go out from this conference that a modern, compassionate conservatism is right for our times, right for this new generation, right for our party, and right for our country. And if we have the courage to grab it, to seize it, the bravery to fight for it with every ounce of vigour and passion in our bodies, nothing and no one will stop us. Thank you.
Jess, you suggested this one. I remember the contest. It was close, but not that he was the leading candidate. Is this the speech that tipped him over the line, and if so, how?
It was. I mean, it was back in 2005, October 2005, the Tory party conference, leadership competition going on at the time. And David Davis was the favourite. And David Cameron was this kind of young underdog, basically hadn't been an MP for very long. And they both delivered their speeches to the Tory party conference. And overnight, David Cameron became the favourite off the back of this particular speech that you've just played a clip of. And much has been made of it at the time, that it kind of turned things around, changed the course of, David Cameron's life, obviously, and also British politics. I think what he did so powerfully in that speech, and actually I went back and listened and reread the David Davis speech, which isn't bad at all. It's pretty well written. If you put them alongside each other, I'd say they're both very well put together. But what Cameron does is he's pretty daring in his approach. He gives the Tory party, some harsh truths. He says Labour have failed, but so have we. And that's, pretty bold for a prospective leader to say to the party faithful. So I think, as with many speeches, the most famous speeches in politics, they're the ones that do something daring, that confound expectations. And that's certainly what Cameron did with that particular speech. Whereas David Davis kind of trotted out the same old sort of Tory fare, Tory red meat. He kind of goes through crime and terrorism and talks about drugs and family breakdown, and it's Tory red meat, but it's kind of stale red meat by this point. And David Cameron's coming here with a fresh message and focusing on education and life chances. So he's pretty bold. It was a risk, but it paid off because it totally turned things around for him.
Okay, well,
sorry. It's also theatre, isn't it? Because Davis delivered his in a conventional way on a podium, standing still. Cameron moved around and did it kind of without notes, and it was he was embodying the fact that he was new and young and vigorous in the way he did it as well. So when you read it back, it's a bit ragged, but actually it was brilliant at the time. A really consequential speech, I think, because I think it won him that contest, and it did change politics in the way most speeches don't. It's harder to trace the impact of some speeches, even Martin Luther King. It's not that easy to trace directly the impact of that speech in particular. But with the Cameron speech, I think it was absolutely directly consequential in winning him that role.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Look, Phil, you'll remember our last speech very well, I'm sure. This is Tony Blair's conference speech in 2006 on the legacy of New Labour.
And the true believer, the true progressive, believes in social justice, in solidarity, in help for those not able to help themselves. They know the race can't just be to the swift and survival for the strong. But they also know that these values, gentle and compassionate as they are, have to be applied in a harsh, uncompromising world. And that what makes the difference is not belief alone, but the raw courage to make it happen.
So, Phil, a quick answer if you can manage one. But we've got to move on. But what's the function of a speech like this when it's a speech about a legacy? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to sort of safeguard your own legacy, or if you're the speaker, or are you trying to sort of leave people reassured at your departure? What's happening?
You're trying essentially to bind in your successors. So you're trying to make an argument that's so compelling that the person who's coming next will accept that tune, that Tony Blair's only tune, which is you've got to be nice, but you've also got to be realistic, is the only way that Labour Party can win. So that was the essential purpose of that speech.
Absolutely. Right. Okay. Well, look, that's a fairly comprehensive whistle-stop tour of great political speeches. But what can today's politicians learn from them? Well, find out next on Times Radio.
Matt Chorley on Times Radio.
Since 1785, Times journalists have been writing the first draft of history. In our series, The Political Editors, we reflect on half a century of politics with the people who had a front row seat. In part 6, Francis Elliott on David Cameron's referendum gamble, the misery of Theresa May's Brexit years, and the prospect of Boris Johnson handling a pandemic.
Tomorrow morning from 10 on Times Radio.
It's the last few days of the Furniture Village sale. Don't miss final reductions on a huge range of sofas, beds and dining. So with style and quality this good, there's only one place to go this bank holiday. But hurry, many offers end Bank Holiday Monday in the Furniture Village sale.
What's twice as epic but half the scale?
Oh, a riddle. Is it a mini go-kart? They're pretty epic.
No, it's my new Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 5, which unfolds into a huge double screen. Multitask on 3 apps at once.
Oh, cool. Got any racing games on it?
Join the flip side and buy the Galaxy Z Fold 5 from Samsung.com. Get up to £650 off when you trade in your eligible old smartphone. Purchase by 5th of September. £650 based on Galaxy S23 Ultra 256GB. Values vary by model and condition. T's and C's apply.
Download the free Times Radio app from the App Store or Google Play today.
Hugo Rifkind on Times Radio.
Hello, this is Hugo here on Times Radio. It is 10:26. We've been thinking about some of the greatest political speeches of all time. I'm still joined by Phil Collins, Jess Cunniffe, and Chris Wilkins, all former speechwriters for different prime ministers. Chris, talk us through the process of writing a speech for a prime minister. How does it work? Does the prime minister come to you with an idea? Do you go to them with an idea? Do you have loads on the sort of the back burner waiting for the right event? What's the process here?
I think every prime minister does this differently, as you'd expect, but really that depends on their enthusiasm for actually making speeches in the first place. So to talk to my experience of working with Theresa, she didn't love the process of communicating really or making speeches. So when a big speech was coming up, you'd have an initial conversation with her about kind of what the key themes were, but actually she would largely then let the team go off and draft them and come up with something, and that might go through a few drafts before actually something was presented to her, and that would often be not long before the speech was actually due to be delivered. I remember one speech in January of 2017 in the USA when she went over to speak at a Republican convention there, and I remember as we were landing in Philadelphia where the speech was to be delivered, I was still writing the conclusion of the speech as we were coming into land, because such was the sort of busyness of the time. But in that example, it was very much, here's an initial idea, now I'm going to trust you to go away and draft it. And I'd known her for many years, so had that sense of her voice, her speaking style, how she liked things to be written in my head. And so to have that trust was great. But as I say, it came out partly as a result of the fact that she didn't love the process of making speeches, and hadn't sort of come up in that way, whereas I think some other prime ministers who'd been more, I think probably Jess can talk to this, but David Cameron, for example, who'd been a special advisor, who'd probably been a speechwriter at times, probably enjoyed the process a bit more and therefore was a bit more involved than Theresa was.
Well, I mean, Jess, coming to that, who do you need to sort of get rid of when writing a speech? Who do you need to push out the room and make sure is excluded? And is that sometimes the prime minister themselves?
No. I mean, it was David Cameron was very hands-on with speeches, as Chris had said, and you're right. Other people kind of tried to get involved as well, but he was quite good at just speaking to the speechwriters about the speech. And if you're holding the pen, you're the one who decides what's going in and what's not. And people, when you circulate these things, they will have their say, as we all know in our experience. And Peggy Noonan, who Phil referred to earlier, writes about this in her biography. The amount of people that want to have their say and shoehorn their own bits in, but ultimately you're holding the pen. And I was very fortunate to work with a prime minister who took my drafts and read them and worked on them, and we had lots of back and forth, a bit like Chris is talking about, with drafts via the red box or via email. So he was very straightforward to work with on speeches, and we didn't have too many arguments about getting rid of people. People would often pipe up, and if there was quite a kind of crunchy line or a punchy or topical line, they'd just try and strike it out and say, oh no, that this is a bit controversial. But if people are very good at striking things out, very few people can actually come up with decent things themselves. So that was always my
Phil, are Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer good speakers, would you say, and how could they be better?
I don't think either of them, you'd say, are wonderful speakers. I mean, both of them are a bit flat. But then that's just who they are. I mean, there's no point lamenting that in the way you've got.
No, I think we're losing. I think we're losing Phil's line while we try and get it back. I mean, I'll put that question to you, Jess. The same question: Are Sunak and Starmer good speakers, and how could they be better?
I think they are. As Phil said, that's just kind of, it's often a bit flat. I mean, we often talk in speeches, you want light and shade, and I feel like often the Prime Minister Sunak is all light and Starmer is a bit all shade. They need to have a bit more balance in there and really play to their strengths. As I said, the great speakers really connect with their audiences, and they need to find those kind of points of connection with the people that they're talking to and use language in that way. And really, avoid jargon. I mean, they fall into the trap. Lots of politicians fall into the trap of using lots of jargon. And really, if they come back to those sort of Martin Luther King principles of making everything concrete and relatable and understandable and things that people can, get to grips with, that would stand them both in good stead to make better speeches.